This week, Nathan Hunstad, Principal Security Engineer and Researcher at Code42, joins us for an interview discussing SIEM and SOAR. In the enterprise security news, secure and monitor AWS Lambda with new but not related features from Datadog and Imperva. ServiceNow integrates with Microsoft Solutions. SentinelOne wins 2 awards. Reducing risk with IAM. Kemp launches Zero Trust. AWS launches another container product. Zscaler acquires Smokescreen, the company, not an actual smokescreen, unfortunately. Maybe both. Sumo Logic acquires DF Labs, Uptycs, Salt Security, and SpecTrust, secure funding, and more. We close out the show with 2 pre-recorded interviews from RSAC 2021 featuring Drew Rose from Living Security and Ganesh Pai from Uptycs. Stay tuned for all that and more on this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we talk security vendors and aren't afraid to name names. It's Enterprise Security Weekly.
Today's connected world leaves no room for errors. Neustar reliably secures those connections. Neustar's cloud solutions, which include web application security, DDoS protection, DNS services, IP geolocation, and threat intelligence, ensure network availability across the globe. With over 20 years of award-winning security experience, Neustar proudly enables and protects digital assets of some of the world's largest enterprises. Find out how your company can benefit from the power of Neustar's trusted connection by visiting securityweekly.com/Neustar. Secure your world with Neustar. Always on, ultra secure. Stopping advanced threats requires knowing exactly what you're up against. ExtraHop Reveal X is the only solution that shows you not just where intruders are going, but where they've been. 90-day look-back and complete network visibility across the data center, cloud, and device edge help security teams respond 84% faster with ExtraHop Reveal X network detection and response. Explore the interactive demo at securityweekly.com/ExtraHop. Welcome to Enterprise Security Weekly, episode number 229 for May 26th, 2021. I'm your host, Paul Asadorian, joined remotely by Mr. Adrian Sanabria. Adrian, welcome.
Hi there. Looking forward to today. Great title there, and just got my show notes updated.
Sweet. Mr. Tyler Shields is here with us. Tyler, welcome.
Hey guys. Yeah, great to see y'all again.
Outstanding. If you'd like to stay in the loop, all things Security Weekly, make sure you visit securityweekly.com/subscribe. You can subscribe via your favorite podcast catcher or to our YouTube channel. Sign up for our mailing list, join our Discord server, and follow us on our newest live streaming platform. That's right, we are on Twitch. And I guess the show's over because my teleprompter is blank. So if there was another, there is another announcement. If you have a specific guest or topic you'd like us to cover on one of the shows, submit your suggestions for guests by visiting securityweekly.com/guests. Complete that form. We'll cover those topics and we'll cover those guests. That's right, we have blankets. So please do that. We love your feedback. Nathan Hunstad is a principal security researcher at Code42. You can learn more about Code42, as this segment is sponsored by Code42, by visiting securityweekly.com/Code42 for Code42's Insider for Insider Risk Management. In this segment, though, Nathan's going to talk about SIEM and SOAR along with the rest of us. Nathan, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. Happy to be here.
Yes, very nice to have you. The topic is very timely. As I was saying before we got started, that there's some acquisitions, and I think we've seen a history of acquisitions and or new features being added by the SIEM vendors because SOAR is so important. So I guess, Nathan, I'll turn to you to kind of set the stage and exactly what we mean by those terms and how they relate.
Yeah, absolutely. So SIEM is a very fundamental part of a lot of security programs. SIEM stands for Security Incident and Event Monitoring or Management. And it's really the centralized tool that a lot of security operations teams, SOC teams use to manage the various events and alerts they're getting from all their security tools, categorize them, prioritize them, do some event correlation to try to bubble up the worst or the most critical events and alerts to the SOC team, and use that as jumping off point for investigations. So like I've said, that's a very, very frequent and very common tool in the security space, and it's had a lot of problems. It's complicated. Correlation rules are hard to set up, and so a lot of teams are now looking more towards SOAR, which is security orchestration, automation, and response, which is relatively new to the industry. It's been around for a few years, and it's something that security teams use to automate and speed up a lot of their investigations and try to reduce that dwell time, reduce that time to contain by automating a lot of your typical response actions, whether that be isolating hosts on a network, whether that be putting firewall rules in place to block malicious traffic, and so forth. I've worked with both. I've worked with many different SIEM tools in the past. I have worked with a couple SOAR tools as well, and I do think that the approach taken by SOAR is the way of the future, and that, as you mentioned, SIEM tools are looking more and more towards automation and buying or building that kind of response. So it is, I think, one of the bigger trends in security operations today.
Nathan, what do you look for in a really good SIEM platform and the SOAR functionality? What's some of your evaluation criteria?
Yeah, I think ease of use and low maintenance is really important when it comes to both. I think it's especially important when it comes to SIEM because those, like I said, tend to be a lot more complicated. With most, enterprise tools, you're not going to have to worry a lot about whether they integrate with, common log formats and some of the major vendors, because most of those do that. I would say that one benefit you do get if you go with a SIEM tool that is from one of the major security vendors that you may already have other tools with, you can get maybe a little bit better integration. But that's certainly not a requirement. When it comes to SOAR tools, it's all about the integrations. It's all about what tools can your SOAR plug into in order to drive remediation. And that is specifically taking actions on your firewalls, on your email filters, on your web filters, and so forth. So you want to make
Nathan,
sure.
I want to stop right there because I think what you've said is very fascinating in the difference in the evaluation criteria. Because with SIEM, it's more about usability and maintainability. With SOAR, it's more about features, right? And I think that's an important distinction because I think in the past we've been like, my SIEM needs to have this feature, that feature. It's less about a feature battle on the SIEM side, more about usability. And on the SOAR side, it is about features because it has to integrate with your security stack.
Yeah, absolutely. And SIEM is obviously a lot more mature tool. It's been around for a lot longer. And SOARs are still early enough in that they do take different approaches to how they do actions or playbook management and so forth. So I do think that there is a lot more innovation going on in the SOAR space right now. And that is why feature differentiation is one of the prime things to look for when you are evaluating a SOAR tool.
Adrian, I know you have thoughts on this topic.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of challenges here. The integrations are a challenge. I've managed a lot of SIEMs in my days, and it was always a challenge there when you had to write a parser, when they were missing a parser. And I imagine a lot of people run into the same issue with the SOAR integrations. And I think as Security Weekly Labs does product reviews, one of the things we're really focusing on, is how you can be successful with them. Who do you need on staff? And certainly with SIEM and SOAR, like as great as the integrations are, you're still likely to have to write some code at some point or to build a parser at some point, or, JSON CSV needs to become JSON. JSON needs to become something else, and you got to have people that can do that. So, I'm curious if you agree there. If one of the big challenges you see is the labor that you have to put into these tools.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And you definitely have to put in labor with both. On the SIEM side, I would say it's more, tuning, configuration, making sure everything is working correctly, which is a little bit less interesting, I'd say, than on the SOAR side, where you're right, you are writing code and you are writing integrations. That is a lot more flexible. And that, frankly, I think that's a lot more fun. And that's where you also have to look at how supportable the other security tools are in your environment when you think about bringing on a SOAR tool. Things like API documentation are incredibly important because, like you mentioned, there may not be an integration already written for one of the tools that you use in your environment.
I want to jump in and comment on something you said, and I think it's more than just fun. So at RSA, there was a keynote by Wade Baker and Wendy Nather who were going through the security practices that result in desirable outcomes. And one of those that was way high on the list, it was in the top 5. I forget exactly where it was. But well-integrated security systems was paired with, better employee retention, and better morale in the security team. So I think it's more than just fun. It's very rewarding to be able to automate some of these tasks that really suck to do manually. Where literally that old saying of replace you with a small shell script, that's what you're doing, and it's not a bad thing because the thing you're replacing with a shell script really sucks to do by hand.
I 100% agree. And, that's one thing that I think that I've tried to do in my career, and that is look to automate and get rid of all of the little things that really aren't adding a lot of security value because, we all know that there's a shortage of analysts, there's a sort of security expertise in general, and it is a waste of an analyst's time to try to track down, a DHCP log entry that matches an IP to a host name and all the silly little things that are crucial to an investigation, but are 100% automatable. And when you get rid of that mental burden on the analyst's side, you get a lot more time to really dig in deep and do those investigations and do things like threat hunting that really add a lot of value to the security organization's overall maturity.
Yeah, I like to think of it as you're not automating the analysis piece, right? You're automating the workflow that aids in your analysis. Analysis may not be the right term there, but when I bring up automation, whether it's in the context of security or any kind of operational activity, I've been phrasing it as automating the workflow. And exactly what you're saying, like bringing those pieces in automatically, putting them in an assembly line, sending feedback back to people that need it. That's automating the workflow so that you're set up better to do your job as an analyst or an engineer to build something or go discover something, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I really like the way that you phrase that. Absolutely.
So what are some of the use cases that you see? What are some of the more exciting, because that's one of the things I've run into with these. I actually worked on the vendor side and, worked with the Phantoms and Demistos on our integrations with those tools. And one of the things that constantly comes in is, like I've noticed there's a couple of very obvious use cases, that are there out of the box that people might use. And then after that, they're kind of scratching their heads. Yeah,
I'd agree with that. The obvious use cases are the ones that are still valuable, like phishing response and so forth. I think overall, when you have a SOAR tool, it really allows you to just open up and start brainstorming new events or new alerts to set up that you may not have wanted to do in the past simply because it's overwhelming. And those are things like every time a domain admin logs in to your environment, I think that should be an alert that generates an investigation. Even if that happens a high number of times a day, for example, that's still a super important event in your environment. And using SOAR, you may be able to automate that investigation quite thoroughly, where you can handle the increased volume of alerts. So that's why I think it really opens up the security team's brainstorming to be able to think through or come up with things that may normally be too noisy, but with SOAR you can handle at scale.
So quick question. The SIEM, I've heard a lot of complaints about SIEMs being overwhelming with alert fatigue, and you kind of touched on it a little bit in that answer, but I want to double click. Is one of the appropriate ways to solve the alert fatigue problem the automation side of the house? Is that a natural 1-2 punch to get past the overwhelming nature of traditional SIEM models?
Yes, absolutely. I do think that they do pair very well together, and that's why so many SIEM vendors are purchasing SOAR tools and SOAR capabilities these days. When you do have alert fatigue, and it's definitely a real thing, being able to handle those alerts at scale and investigate more is really important. I think the trap that a lot of people fall into with SIEMs when they have alert fatigue is that rather than try to find better ways of investigating all those events, they just turn them off. And that's where you start missing things.
Yeah, that's where the pain occurs. And then have you thought about integrations into either traditional CMDBs or the more modern cyber asset management systems? Because I think, one of the deltas between the new versions of asset management and traditional SIEM is event driven, where cyber asset management is kind of more asset detection and continuous update of state of assets. I think that's a natural 1-2 punch that would marry well with SIEM and SOAR as well.
Yeah, agreed. I do think that at a very simple level, a lot of investigations have to start with the basics. What is this endpoint that's in my environment? Does it belong here? And being able to tie in that automation with like a CMDB tool is a very effective way to, again, handle those kinds of things at scale.
Yeah, that's a great 1-2 punch is pulling those things together. We're seeing that from our side as well.
I think that's really interesting. It almost makes me want to update my magic, not quadrants, enchanted quadrants is what I call them to avoid any controversy, right? Where you collect data from endpoints, from other log sources, threat intelligence, and the network. What I think is kind of interesting, Tyler, Nathan, based on what you both said, was I could almost draw a circle in the middle of those 4 quadrants and go asset management is critical, interface to that, right? Because in all of those sources, like they're going to feed, it's going to be a two-way relationship, right? You're going to feed into asset management, but also I need to know what my assets are when I'm doing an investigation that's maybe correlating from some or all of those other areas.
Yeah, what we're seeing actually from the Jupiter One perspective on that side of the fence is what our head of research, Sunil Yu, calls left of boom and right of boom, right?
Yep.
And so you've kind of got your cyber asset management systems like Jupiter One and Exonius that are left of boom, constantly taking inventory, knowing what's what at any given moment in time, all the way down to the asset-specific meta detail. And then right of boom, when the event occurs, the marriage of the SIEM plus the asset management system gives the SOC analyst just a phenomenal way of triaging quickly that they wouldn't have been able to do otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I think that the problem is even bigger these days because so much of our infrastructure is SaaS. It's in Azure, it's in AWS, and so forth. And your traditional asset management tools can't keep up with that. They're not well integrated with that. Whereas a SOAR tool may allow you to query in real time against AWS and find out, who owns that EC2 instance, what's the information about it, what's the tags, what's the metadata, and provide that very valuable information for an investigation.
Yeah, and you can't get to the point where you're truly automating with SOAR unless you know what you have and can tie that into it as well. Because you do have an automated workflow, but I think I always take pages out of DevOps, right? When that automated workflow happens, I want someone to be aware that that's happened or is happening, right? And in order to notify the right person, you have to know what you have and who owns it and maybe who manages it and the responsible parties. And I think that's what newer asset management gives you in the context of this conversation. And it's super important. Because I mean, before I would do this at university. I'm like, wow, yeah, I looked at my logs manually and that system's definitely compromised. I'm like, I wonder who owns that system. I'm like, I wonder what building like, let's start with what building that's in, because I had a 144 acre campus, right? And then based on what building it's in, maybe I can know what department it is, and maybe that can tell me who I need to call, right? And that, I mean, that was actually one of the biggest roadblocks to doing incident response.
Yeah, absolutely. And that actually brings up another point, which is that, once you figured that out, that you can repeat it, you have that capability, but how do you transfer that to other people? Whereas if you can put that into a SOAR playbook, now that is instantly usable by everyone on the team, even somebody who was, on the SOC, on the job their first day. So that's another way that you can leverage a SOAR to really capture that institutional knowledge and make sure that people are doing the right things and being consistent.
Yeah, and you bring up a great point, because before there was a lot of the sophistication in automation, I'd just be like, well, I don't know who owns it. I'm like, just turn off the port and then see who calls the help desk. But then you'd have to notify the help desk that you were doing that you were turning off that port, so that when someone called, they'd put the pieces together, and that didn't always line up. And that just creates friction across the board.
We call that asset inventory by outage.
Yes. Not a good way to it usually is, someone's manager or, executive calling you very angry, calling your manager, right? It's not the way to do it. Yeah, definitely knowing who owns stuff is still hard today, because like you said, Nathan, these assets now exist in the cloud, and they're not even assets as we typically think of them, right? They're some service running somewhere, and we got to know who's responsible for that.
Exactly. I mean, they may be ephemeral. They may be a Docker container that exists for an hour to do a job, and that is gone forever. And that is a hard situation to live in, but that's the reality of most security teams these days.
Yeah, absolutely. What are some of the best integrations with SOAR? You mentioned firewalls and other kind of blocking technology. Are there other integrations that you're really fond of with your SOAR platform?
Yeah, I think that SOAR matches well with EDR tools because a lot of the alerts and investigations you may be involved in do involve an endpoint that a user owns, and being able to take steps or take actions against that endpoint, be it collecting processes, ending processes, putting firewall rules in place so that you can essentially pause and call a timeout while you do a further investigation. That's a really important one. Another one is, I think, whatever tool you're using for a mail gateway or mail scanning. If you do especially notice something like a targeted phish against your users, being able to quickly block that, quarantine it, do something with it so it doesn't get to your end users, or even better, pull it out of the mailboxes of those users who have already received it. Those are things that 100% will improve the security of your organization.
Yeah, I like that too, especially as people are working from home more than ever. Although people are starting to go back in the office, but not 100% of the time. So there's no port to turn off. And using your EDR as your kind of virtual port, right? And being more precise with it. Being able to end a single process rather than just disable the entire port, right? We don't always have that luxury.
Absolutely. That's another thing that we all have to deal with as well, and that is the remote workforce. And so being able to at least provide your SOC team with a bigger menu of actions versus just the, all right, block out of the firewall. Well, they're not behind the firewall.
Yeah, and of course, that would tie into your insider threat system as well. I'm sure you have integrations into Code 42's Insider, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, we do have integrations into our own Insider tool, which we obviously use in-house as well to monitor for insider threat. So as with both SIEM and SOAR, the more data you can get in there, the more value you get overall. But I think with SOAR, since you have the response there as well, it's that much more useful to have that extra data and extra integrations in place.
Absolutely. Well, Nathan, thank you. Oh, sorry. Closing questions. Sorry, I was premature.
Yeah.
We still have a
Sorry,
couple minutes.
we had a question on Discord about in your position, it might be tough to play favorites with commercial SOAR vendors, but maybe you could mention what platforms you have integrations with, and I don't know if there are any real open source options out there. Do you?
I'm not aware of any great open source options when it comes to SOAR tools. I do know that Code 42 Insider has integrations with both Splunk Phantom and Palo Alto's Cortex XSOAR. We use XSOAR internally, and so that's an integration that we find very valuable. In terms of open source, there's a tool that I've seen called the Hive that kind of does some of these things, but it's definitely not as robust as a SOAR tool, unfortunately.
Right. Okay.
Outstanding. Nathan, thank you for appearing on Enterprise Security Weekly today.
Thank you very much. I had a great time.
Outstanding. We did as well. For folks who want to learn more, you can visit securityweekly.com/code42. With that, we'll take a short break and talk about the enterprise security news. Stay tuned. Searching for the best way to protect passwords and privileged accounts? Thycotic empowers security and IT operation teams to discover, secure, and manage all types of privileged accounts with the fastest time to value of any privileged access management solution. Get up and running fast with solutions for privileged account discovery, turnkey installation, automation, auditing, and reporting tools with Thycotic's free 30-day trial. Thycotic, the fastest growing PAM provider in the market, available both on-premise and in the cloud. Get started today with a free Thycotic secret server trial at securityweekly.com/Thycotic. Wide-scale adoption of cloud applications, an increase in remote workers, and expansion of branch offices has rendered the centralized, on-premises security model impractical. Enter Cisco Umbrella. Umbrella now includes secure web gateway, firewall, and cloud access security broker functionality, plus integration with Cisco SD-WAN, all delivered from a single cloud security service. It helps businesses of all sizes secure their network and extend protection to roaming users and branch offices. Security doesn't have to be complicated. Get simple, smart, and powerful security with Cisco Umbrella. Visit securityweekly.com/Cisco Umbrella to learn more. When it comes to web app and API security, the choice is simple. You can choose Fastly's security solution that teams will actually use in full blocking mode, just like 90% of their customers. Or you can stick with costly options that you probably just turn off. You can get Fastly's all-in-one platform that protects apps everywhere they live, however they're built. Or departments can agree to disagree. You can go to securityweekly.com/Fastly to learn more. Or you can just wish you had. Welcome back to Enterprise Security Weekly. In our May 27th webcast at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, we'll explore the latest attacks against DNS and the latest techniques that make it possible to discover and disrupt attacks. The content is going to be very awesome and very surprising, even to Adrian and myself as we're still developing it, which makes for the best webcast. In our June 3rd webcast at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, you'll learn about pen testing tools, specifically Core Impact and others, and some of the updates there and how to use them on a regular basis. Join us on June 10th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time for our webcast on insider risk to learn how to quickly mitigate data exposure risks. Visit securityweekly.com/webcast and /on-demand for the archive. We are more than happy. I think that means we're exuberant. More than happy is exuberant. We are exuberant to announce that we'll be at InfoSec World 2021 in person on October 25th through the 27th in Orlando. Our annual partnership with InfoSec World is extra special as we're all on the same team underneath the Cyber Risk Alliance. What does it mean for Security Weekly listeners and InfoSec World attendees? You get to see and hear from many of the Security Weekly team at the event, and you get 20% off your world pass. Please visit securityweekly.com/ISW 2021 to register. Now we're on to the enterprise security news. What do you say we just dig right in? And there's not a lot of stories, there are a good number, but not an overwhelming amount as we're accustomed to covering on the show, which lets us dig a little deeper. I had pulled two that I thought were interesting, and actually I'm going to be looking at myself, is that I think there's still this issue of when you run serverless functions such as Lambda, which is really just one type of a kind of, cloud native functions are in a separate category from a Lambda serverless function, Lambda being one of the more popular ones from AWS. Now, Datadog has made an announcement that allows you to collect telemetry from your serverless applications. So there are Lambda extensions that allow that collection, and developers can add custom business metrics, distributed tracing, and collect logs from serverless applications. We're actually just talking about that. We got a container that spins up and then spins down and goes away. The IP address is ephemeral. Collecting logs from that, I think, is not just important for monitoring, as a Datadog's kind of perception of the problem, but it's also critical for security as well. I got to know what's going on in these serverless functions. It's super important, especially if they're in Azure, because the breakouts in Azure, there was like 2 or 3 in the stretch of 6 months. So,
yeah. Do you know how that technically works, though? That's what I'm curious about. Is how it says it deploys as a serverless function itself. But yeah, I guess I'd have to actually implement it to understand fully
I couldn't tell you
how it works.
exactly how it works. I have theories as to how it might integrate. There are logging facilities when you spin up containers, specifically in AWS, that I'm familiar with, that you could utilize to collect the logs. There are ways to shim a serverless application. I don't like, security wise, it's kind of a double-edged sword. Like, you can throw a binary inside of a serverless app, but that's typically like not recommended.
Basically, it becomes agent-based, right?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's also dependent on what the telemetry you're looking to collect is, right? If you're looking to collect operational runtime telemetry at like at the lowest possible levels, that could be very different than serverless kind of application code telemetry or operational telemetry at those higher levels. And so I think it's a permissions thing. And I'm not sure exactly how it works technically either, but based on your description, I'm sure it's some kind of cross-serverless permissions model that allows the data to be pulled out.
I'm sure there must be solutions that allow you to do it over an API. So when I code my serverless function, if I've got telemetry or data of any kind I want to send somewhere for historical purposes and logging, I just hit an API and the API sends it off to wherever.
Yeah, you can always instrument your app directly within the application itself, but obviously that has a certain level of overhead, a certain level of developer requirements.
Yeah.
Right. And so, you're better off relying on cloud native type solutions. And I don't know if Datadog in particular is using cloud native AWS types of calls, or if they're requiring instrumentation into the app, into the serverless itself.
That was my bad. I was reading ahead. I was looking at the Imperva AWS Lambda one, which is talking about actively protecting.
Yeah,
not
that
just
was interesting too, right? Yeah,
telemetry.
So more obviously a straight security play from Imperva. They say you can protect against malicious activity, and a whole host of stuff. I put the whole list of basically what the functionality was in there. It can monitor. It has OAuth serverless top 10 coverage, which is really interesting. I haven't dug into exactly how that works.
So my gut tells me they're doing some kind of proxy model in front of the serverless Lambdas, because that's how Signal Sciences, I think, does it as well, which is now part of Fastly.
Yep.
And it makes a lot of sense because they don't have to be in app. They can come out of app and be in front of it, and then eventually be in the CDN layer in the case of Imperva and Fastly both, being a CDN edge security model. So it's probably something that's proxy based, as the requests come back and forth. And it's likely built on top of the Signal Sciences acquisition, or in the case of Imperva, on top of the Previty acquisition that was done there.
Yeah, agreed.
Is there significant overhead with that?
No,
for the execution of the...
Yeah, it's cool because it's built on CDN technology for one, and the other thing is it just is looking at HTTP requests, so it's not touching the HTTP requests and responses. It's just mirroring them and monitoring them. And there's multiple ways to do that. If you're proxying inline, it could add some latency, but if we were talking 20 years ago,
no more than your traditional WAF.
Yeah,
no more than your traditional WAF would add today. Where some of the RASP technologies that were traditionally in app would have a bit more impact because they were doing the detection inline in app. And there were ways around that. Certain ones would kind of do detections in a somewhat asynchronous way within the app to lower down the overhead impact, but they all had slightly different models, and the proxy model that this is likely using is no more overhead impact than your WAF might have.
Yeah, it's interesting. That ties into another story that I had in my brain. API security, right? Because when I look at our own architecture and study how you would do an AWS Lambda, for example, what you end up with is a lot more APIs because you're spinning a process up, it's doing its thing. After it does its thing, it needs to send stuff back into your application. And I'm not talking about monitoring, but actually application logic and data, right, are part of that flow. That's done over API. You typically in AWS do the API gateway to manage all of your various services, whether that could be a container that you're running somewhere in AWS, and then half a dozen different ways to run a container, whether it's a straight cloud service that you're running, and whether it's a serverless function, right? It all kind of comes through in AWS design, at least the ones I've seen, right, come through that API gateway that manages those communications, which is I think, a much better way of thinking of applications. It does like increase complexity.
Microservices.
Yeah, but it's basically microservices that would be the overarching term, right? To talk about all these services collaborating together to make up the application, which makes API security really, really important. In another place where you might want to have both protection and data collection, and that's what Salt Security does. And they just raised a $70 million Series C, and for their Salt Security API protection platform. Sometimes just discovering that you've got APIs is part of the challenge, right?
Not to be confused with Salt Stack, which was acquired by VMware last year.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that whole API security play, I think, is a big future, extremely high growth security segment. Primarily because the lift and shift that has occurred historically of your applications into the cloud, where you just take your app, you wrap it in a container, shove it in the cloud. Mm-hmm. That model obviously didn't leverage the scale and capabilities of cloud native apps. And so the natural next evolution for that is to take that app that you've just lifted and shifted into the cloud and break it up into its segmented components, and then rewrite those individual features or components in a more microservices-based model, and have all of those communicate via APIs. And that's really the rise of service mesh, the rise of microservices, and eventually serverless, if you want to go that far on your development model. And so I think that Salt Security raise is going to exit really, really well someday for the investors that came in at this stage.
I agree. And I don't want to make it sound easy. That's extremely difficult from a software engineering perspective to do that. I know, because we're going through it right now. It's a huge lift. That's why people, just like we did, I took my app, I put it in a container, and I stuffed it in the cloud. And then I was like, wait, why do I have to maintain a whole bunch of code that, transcodes videos or handles authentication, or then you start like plucking them out.
Yep.
That's the way to go.
That's what I call the atomization of applications. And that's really, every company is going through that right now, based on the back of digital transformation that they had, shoving things into the cloud, saying, hey, we got to become a cloud native, cloud first company. They shove it in there, then they have to break it apart. And then, I think the investments that went into microservices and some of the API security and management stuff were early investments. I think this is going to be a massive growth opportunity. And clearly somebody else does too, by putting $70 million into Salt Security.
Yeah. Let's see. What else do we have on the list? Zscaler picked up a company called Smokescreen. Smokescreen is a platform to help customers protect networks, applications, and endpoints with deception decoys. I had not heard of Smokescreen before. Mm-hmm. Had you, Adrian? I know you were.
Yeah. So I mean, full disclosure, I used to work for Thinkst, and Smokescreen was a competitor. So, yeah, having done some of our competitive intelligence there, I was aware of them. But so that's interesting. Certainly with deception, I think its usefulness has been proven, and so kind of the next step there is to make it as integrated and just no-brainer to deploy it as possible, in as many places as you can without triggering false positives and stuff like that. So, honestly, for somebody like Zscaler who's trying to provide most of the stack for you, mm-hmm. it absolutely makes sense. It's as long as they do it correctly. Like it's one of those things where if done right, it's beautiful. If you mess it up and you start bombarding people with false positives, you're going to burn it for your whole customer base. So they just have to be careful in how they implement it, but it should be a no-brainer win for them.
There's two things about the deception and decoy market that I've always thought. It's not actually about the deceptions and decoys that are going to determine whether that market or a company in that market is successful. What really matters there is the ease of deployment, as Adrian mentioned, and then the so what, right? So if I jam out a bunch of decoys into my environment, and first of all, if I can't single click deploy it into my environment, forget it. The project's over. But let's assume that they've passed that hurdle. I put a bunch of them out there and hits occur, and I can't get an active so what or proper next steps on how to handle that so what. it just becomes a noisy alert system that doesn't really give me value. And I think that's going to be the key to providing the best play here. The other thing that is interesting to connect it back to what we were just talking about with the rise of the APIs, the rise of applications and application atomization, is I do think that decoys at an app level could be very valuable and very interesting as we move more towards cloud native infrastructures where the enterprise doesn't own the infrastructure. We have less of a need for decoys at the infrastructure layer and more of a need for decoys at the application layer. Now, specifically how that manifests itself, I'm not sure, right? Is it a page of an app that just pops up or some new feature or section that once you determine somebody's high risk, it's kind of like almost like a in-app CAPTCHA that's more focused on decoy? I'm not entirely sure, but I think there's something interesting that could be done there.
Yeah, so with canary tokens, there are some use cases there. One that we would pitch is create an image canary token and put it on a page that somebody would scan, like /admin, but doesn't actually exist on that system. And now it does exist, and every time somebody goes there, you get an alert. And 100% of those alerts are people trying to scan your website or manually, looking for a way in. And you can just treat all those IP addresses that those requests come from as scanners.
Yeah, I think it gets tricky when you want a one-click deploy, but it's a custom application. That gets tricky. I think that's probably why we haven't seen a big support for that inside the application. Because I started thinking about in my own apps, like, how would I put decoys in there? And it's like a whole design process. And, Adrian, I think your suggestion is great. Like, just do it at the URL level is probably a great way to start in that.
Yeah, I mean, you're almost reverse engineering the scan. Generally where you start with decoys is by looking at attacker behavior. You look at the stuff that they're likely to do, and then you just build for that. You just plan for that and set traps for them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you could even go so far as to say, like, look at input fields. And basically where input fields might have traditional like rate limiting style attacks where they hit something, credential stuffing, for example, into an input field. Once you see a certain level, creating some kind of decoy that moves them or gives them an actual response where they wouldn't have seen it before, right? There's a lot of different things that can happen there, but I think that market's not near the automation that would need to occur to make that single click and easy enough to use.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, that almost gets into the anti-bot space, like the...
It sure does.
What was it, White Ops?
White Ops, Arcos Labs. Arcos Labs is a big player there. There's a lot of bot protection and fraud protection type solutions that this would start to overlap into.
Yeah.
Let's see. ServiceNow is delivering new security integrations with Microsoft to automate security workflows. So new integrations include Azure Sentinel, Microsoft Threat and Vulnerability Management, Microsoft Teams, and Microsoft SharePoint. Microsoft's got a pretty cool stack of solutions, both straight security in addition to some of those operational and workflow management things, and I can see it integrating kind of nicely with ServiceNow. And a lot of those things are, we were just talking about it earlier, they're really low cost or just included with your subscription. And I like almost behind the scenes, Microsoft has just done a great job of coming up with these low code or no code solutions to help you with your workflows, and integrating that with something like ServiceNow, I think is really, rather than writing custom applications, I mean, you can do a lot of stuff with the whole Microsoft Power Automate, Power App Suite.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not sure I want to use my Teams for incident management, though. It depends on the incident. Yeah, because that's the Teams integration is integrating it with ServiceNow's incident response product.
Yeah, it's like rather than use Slack, use Teams, and you've got this technology overload. Where do messages go?
Yeah, it's just, I can see some folks thinking, no, I want to use something a little bit more out of band for my IR communications.
Yeah, no, that's a great point too.
Then something incredibly integrated,
yes.
At a time when usually email is the first thing to fall. It's
true. Yeah, Slack can, be largely off-prem and outside of any of your other infrastructure in an IR perspective, a good back channel communication.
Yeah. Always interesting to see what they're doing here. They're also integrating SharePoint with the same tool, the same IR tool.
I think the problem for me with the Microsoft suite is just there is so much functionality, and you just get lost like really quickly between their security solutions and their productivity solutions. You can do it's almost like the pearl of solutions. You can solve the problem like 6 different ways. I'm like, what? I just want one way sometimes, and not all those options.
Yep.
I usually don't cover awards, but SentinelOne had some pretty interesting picks in terms of their awards or interesting awards that they won. So recently, their endpoint security solution came out really well in the MITRE ATT&CK evaluation performed by MITRE Ingenuity. They've released the results, and SentinelOne was the only vendor to achieve complete visibility with 0 missed detections across both Windows and Linux environments. That was pretty interesting. Not that coverage defines 100% of your evaluation criteria. Coverage is also important when we talk about endpoints and vulnerability management. So I thought that was an interesting kind of win for them.
Yeah, I will mention step one, when doing these evaluations with MITRE is the vendor comes in and sets up the product. So
wouldn't the vendor come in? The vendor would come in and set up the product for me, usually, in an enterprise setting.
Would they set it up the same way for an enterprise as for like a closed evaluation, though?
That's the $1 million question right there, Adrian.
Yeah, how much... If you take that same configuration they used in that case and threw it into an enterprise, would it be 1,000 times noisier? I don't know.
Right. Yes. Signal to noise ratio is a thing. They also won the Gartner Magic Quadrant for endpoint protection platforms.
I don't know if that's winning, but congratulations.
Right. I put that in there to invoke an emotional response.
Singularity XDR platform.
Oh, don't get me started on XDR.
Is that what SentinelOne is calling their solution?
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Innovative Singularity XDR platform. It's just amazing how many companies just turned around and had XDR like a couple months after it became a thing.
Well, when we all struggle to define it, everyone can have it because there's no good definition for it. So everyone can have XDR. No one knows what it means. It's provocative. Yeah, we got that.
Yeah.
The way we define it, we have it, right?
As we understand it, we just rebrand EDR to XDR. It was pretty quick find and replace in the code. Well, so in fairness, I think, and it's funny because in the SOAR space also, in the previous segment, we're talking about how, SOAR is, SIEM vendors are becoming interested in SOAR. But SOAR was always kind of there with the SIEM vendors in the first place. Like it just wasn't as developed as we're seeing it now. I remember over 10 years ago, Qualys had SOAR functionality in there. It just wasn't well integrated. You had to do a lot more of the work yourself, but you could build full-on workflows with it. And then I think Logarithm only a couple years after that, like 2012, 2013, was already just head first going into going down that SOAR route. And I think a lot of the EDR folks like SentinelOne were already 98% of the way there, before the new branding of XDR became a thing. So in all fairness, I think a lot of them were already going in that direction anyway.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. Rapid7, with their acquisition of DivvyCloud, positioning themselves to reduce risk with identity access management. It's interesting. This is kind of what it sounded to me when I read this was constant monitoring, continuous monitoring, if you will, of your IAM policy, especially as it relates to cloud environments, which We know what a big rat hole that is, right? Is going down, applying RBAC in your cloud environment and how often it changes, right? We talked about having a microservices architecture, and I think the dark thing that we don't talk about is how to manage those roles and responsibilities of your apps and services and users inside of the cloud environment. And I thought it was a good play to say, like, we can monitor that, and not just a snapshot in time like traditional vulnerability management, but actually monitor as you have changes and put roadblocks in and collect telemetry when someone opens up an S3 share or that microservice now is exposed to the world. Like, those are some of the really basic kind of hygiene things that you have to worry about with your cloud. And I think you can do a good job of managing those by monitoring the IAM in your cloud provider.
I think there's two sides to this one, to the market that DivvyCloud really kind of was dancing around. There's the current state or the at-rest state of your cloud IAM, right? So understanding what the RBAC looks like, who has permissions to what at any given moment in time, are those permissions overextending, et cetera, et cetera. But then the other side of that is like usage of permissions. Like, if permissions aren't used, do they need to exist?
Right.
So there's kind of a more operational side that you can't get just from the metadata of the state of the environment, but you have to look at the actual accesses that are occurring, what privilege levels were being achieved. So almost integrating like a PAM on the right side plus a cyber asset management focused on identity on the left side.
Yeah, and I know you're at Jupiter One, right? But asset management certainly, comes into play, knowing what you have in the cloud, and then because you got to know that before you can say, well, what privileges should the users and this service have? What rights should it have? Like, the example is, I knew we had the service running, and I went to go test it from home, and it's like, that service isn't available. I'm like, I can get just to the office, and then I asked Marcin, our cloud architect, and he's like, yeah, no, I did the rules correct. I'm like, good. Yeah. I'm glad you did it right. But that's just like a point in time kind of thing. It'd be nice to have something that constantly monitors that, because anyone could just go in and make a small change, and now, bam, that service is exposed to the internet.
Yeah, so I think there is an asset management side of that equation, as you mentioned, but there's also, I think, the operational linkages that have to occur between the two, and that's where the value becomes very unique. And I know of at least one stealth startup that's covering this area that's probably going to be out of stealth by end of summer that we'll be able to mention that is exactly doing that.
Yeah, I'd also be curious, I think largely what we're talking about is administrative users, developers, cloud architects, and engineers. But then it also ties into your application. If you're using cloud services, like we just started to manage your end user authentication and roles and permissions, that to me is equally as important, right? Yep. Because I want to make sure that's not broken, misconfigured, or someone's trying to, break in via that mechanism.
Yeah, I think the acquisition was smart by Rapid7. There's a lot of white space here.
Yeah. Kemp launches a zero trust architecture. I've not heard of Kemp before. Always on application experience company. Playing in zero trust. I don't pretend to understand what they were talking about in their description, to be honest with you.
And that's fine, because I don't pretend to understand what zero trust means. So we're on the same page. Zero trust and XDR. Let's take them both out to pasture.
It's proxy authentication.
I understand zero trust. I'm fine with zero trust, but XDR, I'm still. We actually had two great Forrester analysts that I did micro interviews with for RSA that I really need to follow up with, so they can help explain some of that to me.
Well, I need an education from you soon, Adrian, on zero trust, because zero trust to me is a concept where everything is just zero trust of each other. And to be able to say that zero trust in a product to me has never rung true. So I definitely need a brain dump from you, maybe not on this show, but at some point in time.
Yeah, I mean, we spent a lot of time with the Edgewise team that was acquired by Zscaler, and they really truly did have to this day, right? They call it, I don't remember now, I apologize. But they call it something different, but it is that product, and it does work really well. I've not seen anything comparable to that. Could be why Zscaler, acquired them and integrated them with the stack.
Well, I mean, zero trust is like SBOM. Like it's an idea. It's for an architecture specifically. But there's a lot of components of it. and there's a lot of different ways of doing it, like something like an SBOM. But even though they're nothing alike, the problem you run into is when companies start using zero trust metaphorically. So I remember like a couple months ago, I had 2 vendors give me briefings in the same day using zero trust as a metaphor. Their products had nothing to do with the zero trust architecture at all. And it just frustrates me when they muddy the waters like that, just because it's a hot term and they want to use it.
Which is why I've shied away from that term and have become turned off by that term, because to me it is exactly what you're talking about. It's a design. It's a
philosophy.
thing. It's not.
It's like DevOps.
Yeah, it's a philosophy.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily a product that you can just sell the philosophy of, right?
I mean, so zero trust. If I were to explain it in a single sentence, it would be just applying least privilege to employee access controls.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I kind of liken it, if I had to use an analogy, when we went to Disney and we rode the cars. I can't remember the ride, but it's in Magic Kingdom, and anyone can get in the car, right? But there's guardrails. Like I physically can't bump into anyone at least on a left to right, kind of basis. I can only go so fast. It's kind of those guardrails for your applications.
Right, and which is why, take it back to the product that delivers those guardrails. Perfect. Awesome. I get it. But the problem then is we have zero trust identity, zero trust this, zero trust that. And now the whole thing's just been shot.
Yeah. And I think that analogy came to me looking at all the technology from Zscaler, right? And through their acquisition, it actually does that for you. I mean, he showed us demos at one time of like, you've got a Python script and it can't do that stuff because it's limited by those guardrails. To me, that's a good implementation. But you're right. The term gets overused and it muddies the waters. The last story here is AWS is launching a containerized web application solution called App Runner. It's doing a lot for you. It allows you to rapidly develop, deploy, and run containerized web applications and APIs, handling all operational aspects, provisioning, scaling, and managing container orchestration, load balancing, and CI/CD pipelines. That's
and why
a lot.
not?
Yeah, but
why not? It's AWS doing what only AWS can do.
Make it easier.
If you're fully bought into the garden, very similar to, like the Tile competitor that you saw Apple come out with. Mm-hmm. Like Tile could never make their product easier to use than Apple could, because Apple's basically shortcutting the process of onboarding one of these little devices that you use to find your lost keys or whatever.
But much like the Apple example, it can have vulnerabilities and exploits. Oh,
sure. But yeah, from a but at the same time, it's AWS has a pretty good track record, when it comes to securing their side of things. Maybe not always the best track record in educating their customers on how to secure their end of it. I mean, the documentation has been there, but don't underestimate the need for secure defaults there. People, if you give them rope, people will hang themselves.
Well, and I guess BHIS did some research into different AWS services, and as they're auto scaling, they spin up new instances, but not necessarily with the same security controls that some of the other instances have. And so when I saw the App Runner announcement, I'm like, that could be a recipe for disaster in that sense, that as they're auto scaling and managing and load balancing, if the new stuff that's automatically spinning up doesn't have the same security controls, that could spell disaster for the security in your application.
Yeah, I guess I wasn't looking at this with my security hat on. I was more looking at it from the
usability.
Small company, small team,
sure.
Single full stack developer. Like this is beautiful.
Mm. Cool. Anything else you guys want to talk about?
See the ServiceNow upticks, 50 million.
Oh yeah, I forgot to talk about that one.
I had 2 funding items also.
Yeah, Uptycs was a sponsor on the program. Just awesome technology, right? It's so cool how they're able to collect all of that using what was the Facebook thing they built it on?
OS Query.
OS Query.
Yeah.
I looked at OS Query. I'm like, wow, that could be really cool. And then Uptycs came along. I'm like, yeah, that's what I wanted out of OS Query. I didn't want to do all the work myself. Now I've got a well-funded startup, right, that's doing that. So, and I think Ganesh is has the interview on this segment that'll air. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you hear more about Uptycs from Ganesh on the next segment as well.
Yeah. No, I think Uptycs is a super kick-ass company. I've always followed them, and I think the ServiceNow in strategic investment alongside the round that they raised is very important for Uptycs, because Uptycs has insight and visibility into assets,
right?
Into what needs to be scanned.
And in the cloud, that's their huge differentiator. They're like, we're not just an endpoint thing. We live in the cloud.
And so put yourself into the shoes of ServiceNow, where they're a traditional CMDB that's focused on endpoints, right? And it's just hard for them to move into the cloud. So making strategic investments in companies like Uptycs makes a whole lot of sense.
And I think that's kind of going to be the key for Uptycs and any other EDR companies out there, is just fully realizing, all the use cases for that data that they're collecting, because there's so many things that they can make easier, and they even replace in some cases. We're even seeing a lot of vulnerability management use cases come out of EDR products. And I think that's going to be the big challenge there, is building all that and making it, kind of a no-brainer integration with some of these other products like ServiceNow, where, I'd say 9 out of 10 ServiceNow CMDBs you look at are out of date. You need some automated method of keeping them accurate and up to date. And here, here you go. At least for the ones where you have Uptycs installed, the corporate owned stuff.
I think it's something I've described for a few years now as the power of the agent. Everybody bags on agents. They hate agents. They only want one agent. And so what agent is consistently deployed? The endpoint agent, right? And so you can do so many things, whether it's using OS Query as that agent or using a CrowdStrike agent or Carbon Black agent or whatever. You can do so many things once you're on device. You're able to leverage that into secondary and tertiary markets alongside just endpoint protection. And that's why it's super valuable, is you have that inventory.
Yep.
Outstanding. Adrian, Tyler, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for listening and watching. Although this is not the end of the show, we've got a pre-recorded interview coming up. Drew Rose from Living Security and Ganesh Pai from Uptycs. Stay tuned. Here's Jacob. He's uploading documents to the cloud and chatting notes to his outside agency partners. This is Zoe. She's rushing to share the customer list with marketing and is sending the latest product roadmap to her mobile device. Which one of them is creating insider risk? They both are. Everyone creates insider risk, sometimes with malicious intent and sometimes just by doing their jobs. Empower productivity and protect your data with Code 42 Insider. Visit securityweekly.com/code42 to learn more. Today's networks are changing fast, and employees, devices, and infrastructures are more distributed than ever. Gigamon Threat Insight is a cloud-native, high-velocity network detection and response solution that's purpose-built to enable you to get in front of this transformation. Discover hidden network threats, automate security investigations, and optimize security workflows to stay a step ahead of attackers with Gigamon Threat Insight. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Gigamon. Do you worry about ransomware, data breaches, reputation damage, especially from phishing attacks, on employees working from home? The facts are, top cloud security tools have a 15% failure rate. 51% of phishing is social media based. Pixum knows because Pixum detects and stops breaches at point of click. Pixum's AI real-time solution detects actual fraud happening in a browser and stops it. Know your real security gaps. Get a phishing actualization test free at securityweekly.com/Pixum. That's PIXM.
Welcome back to RSA Conference 2021, live from Virtual Broadcast Alley. I am your host, Matt Alderman. Joining me for the segment is Ganesh Pai, CEO and founder of Uptycs. And welcome, Ganesh. It's good to see you again. We've had you on a few times, and you and I go back a little way, so it's a pleasure to have you on.
Likewise, it's a real pleasure to chat with you again, and appreciate you having me on the show.
Yes. We're going to talk about the new perspective on cloud security resiliency. And my first question to you is there an old perspective on cloud security resiliency?
That's an interesting one. Of course, apart from the choice of wording, what is interesting, at least the way I see it, is that cloud itself is fairly resilient. As you know, that it's everything aggregated by one of the three hyperscalers of new newcomers. But when it comes to security, it is actually left to the individual organizations. The cloud providers themselves don't mandate, and that's where there are new approaches and new things that you can look at to understand whether it's your posture or what your workload security looks like.
Yeah, having spent a lot of time in application security, container security, and in this migration to cloud, right? I've tried to keep track of all the new services in Amazon, for example. I mean, there's new services coming up all the time, and they're providing more and more telemetry. But to your point, how do I integrate all that telemetry in and really build a more comprehensive security program when I'm running in cloud? Because you have CloudTrail, you have CloudWatch, you have the different services, whether you're running container as a service, you could be running Fargate. There's so much complexity in the cloud. Bringing all that data together is not easy.
That's right. If you were to look at the sources of telemetry, and if you were to try to come up with an approach to say, what does the telemetry mean and what can I do with it? You can think of the potential work that you can do on the telemetry to draw insight into four different areas. One is, what can you do proactively? Think of it as if you've got various standards and benchmarks such as CIS and NIST telling you that if you do things, have you done it right way? So that's one part. Then there is reactive security, which is your ability to quickly understand if someone's changing a cloud workload, what does that change mean, and what can you draw from that conclusion? Can you draw from that behavioral change? Is it with malicious intent or not? Then there is the ability to understand things based on how the past was. So you can think of it as a predictive approach where you're looking at baselines and deviations from baseline to say, is this normal or not? And then, of course, you can always put guardrails in place and do protection, right? So if you think of it as these four areas that you want to do, proactive, reactive, predictive, and protective, then the question is, what sources of telemetry are you going to rely on to make make sure that what you're doing is fairly robust and reliable and gives you that visibility. And to that end, to answer to your question, AWS provides data, so do all other cloud providers, but they put it into like 3 buckets. Everything at the end of the day either falls into a config or it falls into a CloudTrail activity, which is the behavioral change of the cloud. And then there is interactions with the services which result in flow logs, right? So if you have these 3 pieces of telemetry for the gamut of services that AWS provides, you should be able to do meaningful security across all the services that you've procured from AWS. I know I said a lot, happy to zoom in and double click, but I'll pause you for a second.
Yeah, let's do that. So proactive, let's think about that for a second. Proactive is setting up the right configurations for the different services or infrastructure that you're running, and ways that people would validate that would be, maybe a cloud security posture management solution, right? I mean, that's one way to do it. You also have code coming into that environment, right? And that's all part of like the CI/CD pipeline and all your code and code checks and even some of your infrastructure that's being spun up as code, right? So let's double click into that piece first, because what I'm curious about is how is Uptycs actually helping in some of that proactive, right? The early stage of how do you actually help protect some of those areas?
Great question. You can think of it as 2 parts. When you use the services of a cloud provider, either you're procuring services which the service provider gives you, as in a database service or a load balancer or a caching service, and then you're buying something which is very fundamental. You're buying infrastructure services, as in compute and storage, because you plan to run your own software, which is typically encapsulated either in a virtual machine or in a container and then deployed. So when you engage with the cloud provider, you have to have visibility into what's happening from inside the virtual machine, and you need visibility from what is outside at the cloud orchestration level telling you. CSPM gives you the ability by looking at the cloud configurations and then using reference standards such as CIS or NIST to tell you, have you done your basics right? Are your configurations same, and are they telling you that you've got the check boxes so that proactively you can fix your findings and get a measure that my cybersecurity posture is good. You can do the same from actually inside the machine. There's an equal set of standards. So if you put the practices in place to get both visibility from inside the virtual machine of container runtime as well as from the cloud provider, you then have the ability to formulate a measurable thing to say, what is all this telemetry telling me based on inside and outside?
Yeah, so it's correlating the hosts that are running and the service configurations more into a centralized view. We had an interview yesterday. We were talking about some of the issues in certain Linux packages, for example, right, which are potentially running by default because it's part of the distribution, right? If you don't want those services running, you have to validate that those services aren't installed or not running. That's more inside, to your point, the virtual machine inside the box versus how I configure an S3 bucket or how I configure an ECS or an EKS instance, et cetera, right?
Correct. And in both places, just the config and deviations from config best practices tell you a lot, and just doing these proactive checks help you improve your, it's at the end of the day, cybersecurity hygiene, if you will. But if you look at these places and, tighten up your hygiene, there's a good chance that your resiliency improves tremendously in doing so. Absolutely.
Now, let's go to the next one, which is the response, the reactive side, right? Because when I see a drift in a configuration, it could be, the developers rolled out a new piece of software that maybe changed the config. Somebody went in and changed the config manually. Now you're outside of that baseline, that policy that you set. How do you react to that in an automated way? Because these things are happening potentially multiple times a day in cloud based on how people are deploying software. So then how do you, based on that drift and based on the telemetry that you're getting, how do you react to that in a very effective and efficient way?
Great question. And this gets into the second part, because if the first one is using well-known specifications to establish a criteria to say if your hygiene is good, then despite your best effort, how are you going to react to behavioral changes? When there's a behavioral change, to your question, you really don't know whether it's got malicious intent or not yet, but you have to look at the data, look at the context, and draw that conclusion. In order to make that happen, both cloud as well as your runtimes, back to the prior question's analogy of, you've got your virtual machines and containers where you're running your software, and then you're using services provided by AWS. In both cases, the operating system tells you about the behavioral change by emitting data saying that people are logging in, new software has been launched. In a similar manner, the cloud providers today, they provide you what's called as audit trail data, very specifically using the terminology of AWS, it's cloud trail logs.
Yep.
What these things tell you typically is that after you did a configuration, what were the behavioral changes in the cloud? Did someone start a virtual machine? Did someone go and make a change to a S3 bucket? And as a result of this, there is additional context, which then tells you whether this change in isolation is benign or it's as tied to like other sequence of things which might have happened around it, that they might be like malicious intent, right? So the ability to do a detection and response based on this behavioral intent. Traditionally it's EDR as applied to Linux virtual machines. It could be cloud detection and response as applied to the cloud trail activity.
Yeah, somebody will call it XDR and include CDR in it, right?
Exactly.
So yeah, we'll end up with another DR term at the end of the day.
Exactly.
How does that tie into predictive now, right? Because behavior, right? You just said it, need to monitor behavior to figure out whether it's benign or malicious. But then how does that drive a predictive discussion? Is predictive more on the left side of the dev process to look at what a potential change is going to look like and then analyze it against the existing infrastructure or what that change looks like? Or is it predictive within the runtime environment? I'm curious how that predictive layer comes in.
That's a great question, and there's potential to do it both ways, as you just alluded to. In the first context, especially when it comes to cloud workloads, unlike traditional endpoint workloads, they tend to be more homogeneous in nature. There's typically a controlled environment where you might be using your CI/CD cycles, and you know specifically what kind of binaries you're going to deploy and what kind of outcomes you can expect. So one simple way is to track, because the realm of what's known is very well controlled, specifically in these cloud workload deployments. You can create a list, whether it's of hashes, configs, and track a set of things and say, when something new is being done, is this something expected or not? Wherein effectively what you're correlating is you take a cloud trail change or an operating system behavioral change and say, is this supposed to happen or not? And what you're comparing against is what your engineering or your development cycles told you. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, what you could also do is, to the other part of what you said, is look at the last 30 days of behavior. In a cloud environment, you can see what's the normal when it comes to who are your system administrators, when do they log in, what services have been activated. If things have reached a certain stage and you're providing services, you know that your baseline is such, and you can collect pieces of telemetry. And then when there's the next change coming in, you can say, is this deviating or not? The same can be applied from inside the operating system behavior. Processes being launched, software being deployed, the packages that you have, users, you name it, even socket connections, you can keep track to say, what are the DNS lookups which are done in the last 30 days? There might be a few thousand, 10,000s, 100,000, but it's a list that can be compared against, right? So basic statistical deviations from either what you think is normal or deviations based on your historical runs, both allow you to get some baseline behavior and detect deviations to say, hey, is this potentially an outlier or is this truly an anomaly?
Right. And I think one of the challenges in certain infrastructure, so let's talk containers for a second, because getting that level of information out of the container is not the easiest thing. Having worked in the container security space, you can instrument a container, for example, and get that visibility. You can run a privileged container, you can run a kernel modular, there's a sidecar approach, right? There's different approaches, but sometimes getting that level of granularity at the container is different than getting it at the endpoint, but you need that visibility too, because is that container, forking a process, creating a new network connection that you need to see visibility into for that baseline and for those anomalous detections as well?
Yes, and this is an area where the overall cloud things get complicated, because if you try to move a little bit further out into earlier part of the CI/CD cycles, you have the ability to first figure out that when I build my containers and test the images which are going to be deployed as a part of assembling things together, you have the ability during the CI/CD cycle to do a scan to say that what's going to be packaged and deployed in this container, all the packages, are they supposed to be like known sane? Do they have the right kind of checksums and all that? Now, you've not even deployed software. Once you pushed it out and it's been operationalized, to your point, then there is the second thing to say that as it is operational and running, what am I seeing? And can I take a baseline of that and then check deviations? So runtime versus deploy time and CI/CD is different. And to your point, once inside a container, there are organizations who run containers very differently to say that if there is anything which is unusual in a container, I'm going to treat it, potentially in a different way and shoot that container, because they're not supposed to be tainted. They're supposed to be only read-only, and any behavioral change is not acceptable, right? You're never supposed to log into a container as what someone might set as a behavioral detection. And if someone ever logs in, you know that container is tainted, as simple as that.
Right.
So to your point, yes, it is complex, but as you take it through various stages and break it down all the way from CI/CD to runtime, there is the ability to do deviation detections and behavioral detection across all these phases.
Got it. And then that ties into the last piece, right? On the protection side. And I think part of that comes in the pipeline, right? I mean, having these baselines, making sure you're getting the right instrumentation into the right element as part of that release process is one of the steps from a protection mechanism, because as you identify anomalies, yes, you might kill a container, spin up another one. But if it continues to happen, that means I have to change something over on the other side so it stops doing it, right? And so closing that loop on the protection mechanism requires a lot on the left. How much of that can you actually do during the runtime? Because I think that's where people get most nervous is, if I'm trying to make some of those protection changes in a production environment, does that then break the application, for example?
Yeah. So there are two parts when it comes to protection. Either you try to do it proactively as a part of starting something up. And one nice thing between orchestrated versions of containers and using Kubernetes and other approaches is that you can do a lot of pre-checks in place. And in some ways, they become, if you will, in the stages of the pipeline earlier, where you're trying to prevent from bad things happening by preventing something unknown inadvertently being deployed onto your infrastructure. Right, and that's the part where, if you look at the protective part and you break it down into two areas, you can think of it as potential binary authorization or blocking, and the other part you can think of it as remediation, where remediation, by the very name, suggests that it's a post facto thing, that something has gone wrong, and you're doing your best to protect yourself by stopping or killing a container. On the other hand, binary authorization or blocking is a mechanism where, either due to a known lists that you've supplied, like an allow list or a block list, you have the ability to make decisions to say that, yes, I went through all the stages of CI/CD, but as a final step, I'm going to put this one extra check in there to see if this is allowed to run. And many organizations are trying to come up with more controlled environments where these containers run, as in Firecracker and gvisor and others, where the goal is to see if, despite all the checks that you have in your CI/CD cycle, how can you still do meaningful authorization and blocking. It's a part of the broader binary authorization area, and I think it somewhat works in cloud and container environments. It's harder to do so in traditional endpoint environments for that.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. I know I said a lot. I'm happy to zoom in, but we've been fortunate to have a fair bit of expertise in this area, and happy to provide a little bit more detail if it makes sense.
Yeah, I want to touch on one other point real fast, because the other thing that comes into a resiliency play, and we're seeing some more of this, is the concept of backup and recovery, right? In the cloud, that's a very interesting discussion, right? You can use different services there, but backup and recovery still has some place in resiliency from a cloud perspective, right? Because if one of my infrastructure as a service hosts gets infected with ransomware, and all my data is locked up, I mean, that's a resiliency challenge as well, right?
It is. And that depends on the spectrum and where you are in terms of an organization, especially if the crown jewels of your organization is what you run as a part of the virtual machine and container services that you might procure from a provider such as AWS and deploy the tech. If modern practices, what you try to do is that the actual virtual machine and the container itself is 100% replaceable with one instance of the other, which means if you discover that there is some tainting due to some malicious intent, which you're not sure, but you decide to shoot that container instance and start something new, you have the ability to do so. But what's guaranteed as a part of your overall config and approach is that you'll be able to reinstantiate something which can take over the instance which you just terminated, right? Now, if you didn't do that, to your point, if you're still earlier on in your journey, yes, there is no substitute for doing a backup and recovery. The old school approach of disaster recovery implies that you may not be able to do something in one availability zone. So if you have your replicas and snapshots of storage all done right, you'll be able to reinstantiate it another place, right? But what I described still didn't cover the actual part of the data itself. And for data resiliency, despite all the best technology out there, at the end of the day, best resiliency might still come from having a backup of your data, because if your data got encrypted, it doesn't matter whether your containers and virtual machines are going to be restarted, you're going to be locked out.
You're right, exactly. And I think that's the challenge. That's why I always love these topics around application, user, and data, because data is still a big piece in that resiliency model. And without it, yes, I can have all my cloud services up and running, but if all my data is encrypted with a ransomware key, guess what? The application's still not running.
Correct.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. That's a lot of pieces. Is there any resources that you could point folks to if they want to learn more about how to build out more resilient cloud security services?
Yeah, there's a lot of tutorials and material out there. We as a venture, of course, are fortunate to be providing a fair bit of information here. If you're looking for improving your resiliency during runtime or as a part of your deploy time, we of course leverage open source sensors such as OS Query for providing the telemetry, and then we've open sourced Cloud Query and Cube Query for providing information from your using connectors from using your cloud instances or Cube Query providers. Between these sources, and of course, if you're interested in what we do at Uptycs, we'd be happy to provide more information, but there's a fair bit of material out there that'll allow you to build a more resilient security posture on top of your cloud services.
Yeah, it's a difficult thing to solve, so having those resources I think will be great. Ganesh, thank you so much for joining us on Security Weekly.
Thank you, Matt. I appreciate you having me here.
Oh, of course. And if anybody wants to learn more about Uptycs, please visit securityweekly.com/Uptycs. And with that, stay tuned. We still have more micro interviews left for today.
Welcome back to RSA Conference 2021, live from Virtual Broadcast Alley. I'm your host, Paul Asadorian. Joining me for this micro interview is Drew Rose, the founder of Living Security. Today we're going to be talking about why your phishing program isn't working. The page that you can visit to learn more about Living Security is securityweekly.com/Living Security. Drew, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here. Excited to chat with you this afternoon almost.
Absolutely. I find it interesting. I love the topic, right? Like, why isn't your security awareness program working? What do people usually get wrong when it comes to a security awareness program?
I mean, I think the biggest overall thing that people get wrong is relying on phishing simulations to train their employees to change their behavior. I think phishing simulations have a place in an overall program. But it shouldn't be the one key metric or activity that a security team spends on in order to reduce human risk.
I agree, because I think you can always use a phishing simulation to trick people. And like, what does that really teach them other than like, you can be more creative and get people to click a link? Like, my favorite one is I spoof an email and say, hey, I'm from the IT security department and you want a prize because you're so awesome at security. Click the link to claim your prize. And, we can be as creative about it as we can. All that proves is our creativity, not really helping the user, right?
Yeah, I mean, it becomes, a game to some people, and they actually are hurting the culture and making it harder to change behavior. I mean, you're seeing even over the last couple of months, organizations, tricking, I like the word tricking, their employees to click on, fake malicious links by, talking about vaccinations and bonuses and time off and things around COVID that are very sensitive subjects that really hit home and really hit the emotions hard. And of course, you can see why they would click on it. But again, that's not really showing that you have a weak program or your end users aren't, have a good IQ around phishing. It just shows that you're willing to stoop to any level to get your metric numbers high, which again isn't good. It's just not helpful and it's hurtful.
I think better, in my opinion, a better strategy is to instill upon your users the notion and part of the culture that any communication you get, if you think of it as is a lie, the first thought, then it doesn't matter how we trick the users. I've trained my users, and we've done that here at Security Weekly, largely through like osmosis because they're listening to all of our shows. Any communication you get is probably a lie, right?
Yeah, I like the phrase trust but verify, right? Like, you don't have to walk around just like feeling everybody's out to get you, but you don't want to just rely on a message or an email and say, oh, I'm good here. And so verifying, why am I getting this message? What does it have to do with my life? Is it as important? Is it too good to be true? And that's just a good way. And it goes beyond phishing. It goes to vishing or phone calls. It goes to deals and salespeople and whatnot. And trust but verify is a very strong tenet to try to instill within a user population. I think it's funny, the scam that keeps going around on Twitter. Somebody fakes an Elon Musk Twitter account and says, hey, if you send me half a Bitcoin or whatever dollar in Bitcoin, I will double it and send it back to you because I'm such a generous person. And in fact, I had a family member text me the other day with a very similar scam. And I had to be like, man, do you think this is real? And he's like, yeah, it was on this website. Mm-hmm. I'm like, is this legitimate? Have you ever been to this website before? And I really had to kind of make him think through like, no, this seems great and awesome, and it would be good for your wealth if it was true. But like, why would somebody just give you free money?
Right.
And that really touches on the key aspect around why social engineering works, right? Because a lot of people in IT or cybersecurity, that are maybe new to the industry think like, man, how could somebody fall for a phishing email? Like, they'll never get me. They're so dumb. They're so stupid. But most of the time, when an end user falls victim to a social engineering attack via email or a phone call or a smishing, it's because they're caught up in an emotion. They're not thinking rationally about what is wrong with this that could make it bad. They're thinking about all the positive things that could come out of it or the negative things they can avoid. And that's why, IRS scams, healthcare scams, free money, like those are always going to be the easiest because somebody's like, man, this money would really improve my life. This has to be good. This is good for me. I'm not going to think about the bad things. and they don't think rationally, right? I don't know if you ever heard the term the lizard brain, right? But that's our kind of flight, freeze, or fight response to a situation. And we have that same situation when it comes to those types of threats in our communication stream.
Is it about teaching good habits to people? Is that a good way to kind of phrase it, rather than teaching them about each individual scenario?
Exactly. So I think we take two approaches at Living Security. Our ultimate goal is to change behavior to reduce risk, right? And that behavior change is about introducing good habits. Like pause before you click. Mm-hmm. Think through the scenarios of why this is important to me. What does it have to do? Is it too good to be true? But the second thing we try to instill, especially with our clients, the ones that are purchasing our products, is it's all about relationship building. My last position before starting Living Security, I really took a dramatic approach to human risk management or security awareness training, where my goal was to develop a relationship with all 3,500 users that were in my purview. I wanted them to know who I was. I wanted them to know that I was not out to get them, that if they made a mistake, they weren't in trouble, mm-hmm. and that it was important for them to come to me when they had questions, and that I was never going to be too busy to answer their questions on email threats, web threats, lost devices, password management, password managers, because if I can get in front of the problem, that is going to help to reduce the potential for risk in the future.
I think the culture of fear is not the right approach here. I don't side with that the user should have their pay cut, be fired, be forced to do training as punishment. I don't think that works here. I think positive reinforcement is the complete strategy here.
100%, Paul. When I was just on a call this morning with a new client, and they were talking about, man, all of our clients are asking us if we're doing phishing, in the vendor risk assessments we all have to fill out. And it's something that they're asking us if we're doing phishing because it's such an easy thing to say to the board. Oh yeah, they're doing phishing. Okay, they have a good posture. And that's a conversation for, maybe the second half of this talk or another time. But the recommendation I gave him, because he said on the phone, like, he didn't think our culture would be receptive to phishing simulations. And I completely could agree where he came from. And I walked him through my story of the last time I started a phishing program from scratch. And the first thing that I did, because I wanted to build a positive reception to phishing simulations, I told people that phishing simulation was coming. Mm-hmm. I said, hey, team, in an email, we are just about to launch our phishing program. We all know phishing can cause big problems. At our company, this is what it can do to us. And in the next week, I'm going to phish this entire company. Okay. And yeah, I had a really low click rate and it was great. But that wasn't the point. Like, for me, it wasn't that metric that was important. For me, it was starting the program off, kicking it off with, hey, this is for the good of the company. Yep. This isn't for me to come and make fun or embarrass somebody or make public a list of all the people that fell for it, and for them to get bought into the why. Right? Why is it important that we're phishing people? Most, from what my experience, what I see in immature security organizations is they don't tell their end users why they're doing, fill in the blank security technology. All they see is that this new security technology process product is getting in the way of me doing my job, versus this security technology is ensuring that I'm going to have a paycheck for the next 6, 9, 12 months, because our small business or our large business, the stock is not going to be impacted. We're not going to lose a bunch of revenue. We're not going to lose trust in the industry because we fall victim to a scam.
Yeah, I think it can be used as part of culture building in your example. If you're open and transparent that a test is going to happen, the users will collaborate with each other. And someone may say, I totally clicked on that. And the other person may say, well, I thought it was phishing because of XYZ. They can collaborate. They can have an open conversation with each other, with the security team about it. And it's more of a positive thing that helps build culture rather than a punishment system.
Yeah, I mean, I think I want to say the pinnacle of the success of the program, but like the biggest aha moment that I was doing a good job was in an executive committee meeting with, the C-level executives of a $9 billion company, and the COO voluntarily raising a hand saying, I fell for that last one and I'm never going to get caught again. And him kind of throwing that gauntlet down of like, I got caught, but Drew, it's never going to happen again. And him responding that it is a positive thing and what he learned from it to the rest of the executive team. And that sentiment from the top down, that is what shifts culture. And that's when people start getting excited about it.
Are there other things that you like to instill upon users, outside of, phishing simulations that can really just help in general to make your organization more secure?
Certainly. I mean, a lot of we were talking before we jumped on, we've crossed paths before. We used to host physical escape rooms.
Yeah, those were cool. Yeah, that was a great idea.
I think one of the last ones was at InfoSec World in Orlando. We were right next to each other. We have since transitioned those to completely virtual offerings, and they've really taken off.
Nice.
But to answer your question, that teamwork, that building a team around cybersecurity, good cybersecurity hygiene, and opening up the conversation between the internal team members that do not have a cybersecurity background is another great behavior that we try to instill in our clients of like, if you get 5 or 6 people in a room going through an exercise together online and they're having to ask each other questions and they're having to help each other out, we kind of are diminishing that intimidation factor of like, oh, I'm stupid, I should know that. And they're afraid to be vulnerable within their team versus one of the first ways of, hey, is this a risk? Is this a threat? Is just to ask your neighbor, right? Just to, hey, send a Slack message on the team. And if you can be open with each other and you can help each other internally be more secure, that's absolutely another habit that we try to instill with our products through our Living Security Teams offerings.
Yeah, I think it's a huge win when your organization as a whole not only cares about cybersecurity, but cares about protecting the company from threats in general. I mean, that obviously cybersecurity is a big part of that, but threats in general, I think is really important.
Yeah, it's all about the why. Again, we talked about this a little bit earlier. It's all about like your end users should know why. Like, how does this threat impact our company specifically? Like, you can't go to them and say, hey, don't click on phishing because it's bad. Like, that doesn't resonate with me, right? You don't click on this phishing email because you're an accountant. And if somebody takes over your account, they can send a refund check of $10,000 to 10 people. And now we're out $100,000.
Yeah.
That hits home.
Right. Yeah. It's understanding the consequences. I think non-cybersecurity people, that's the aha moments I like them to have, that there are consequences to this, that it's just not someone else's problem or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what else is going on at Living Security? You mentioned your escape rooms are now virtual. How does that work in a virtual setting?
Yeah, so we've developed a completely virtual experience where a group of 8 to 10 end users join like a session, almost like a Zoom session. And inside that Zoom session, you see each other, you get to talk to each other, and you go through a storyline, a fictional storyline that involves 8 different challenges that all relate to cybersecurity fundamentals. And you have to get through this experience in under 45 minutes. At the end, there's a leaderboard for all the other teams that go through it. And it's something that over this past 6 months, we've been able to scale around the world. So we have different languages. We don't need a host or moderator. So I could launch this experience to 1,000 users in an hour. If we want. And so that's really taken off for us. On the other side, we just raised our Series B a couple months ago, and we're really double downing on our analytics and metrics. And we're building a platform called Living Security Unify. And it's really taking effect, like what I see as one of the biggest gaps in security awareness training is the ability to really understand, is the investment we're making in trying to change behavior, is that working? And the only way to do that is to get access to data that is showing real life behavior. And that data already exists in the entire security stack, like your email security gateway, your web security or proxy, your password manager, your DLP products. And so getting that data, having interventions, and be able to measure if those interventions, like training or communications or changing policy, if those interventions were successful. And so we're launching that product in the next couple of months. And I really think it's the next big game changer in the human risk management field.
What kind of data would you be collecting? Is that like the number of people that report a phishing incident, if that's built into their system and things like that?
Exactly. Yeah. So reporting phishing emails, getting real phishing emails, clicking on real phishing emails, going to malicious websites, going to uncategorized websites, reusing passwords. Really, if you think across the security stack, what is the purpose of a tool that is for a specific vertical like DLP? And what type of events can we derive from that tool that tie back to a specific user? And then bringing all that data into one system, unifying it to look for the groups of users that are at risk in very specific areas, and then targeting them with interventions.
That's awesome. It's a great strategy. Drew, thank you so much for appearing on Security Weekly.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Good luck. This is your last day, right? So you're going to get a talking break after today?
Yes, we're in the home stretch.
Awesome. Well, hey, thanks for having me, Paul. I really appreciate being here.
Outstanding. For folks who want to learn more, please visit securityweekly.com/living security.